the craziest revenge stories in human history. The year is 1860, and it was a crisp October evening in Hartford, Connecticut. A young, loving couple sat beside their fire in their relatively modest shack, anxiously awaiting the delivery of their new baby boy. And while these soon-to-be parents would be overjoyed to have a baby that is nothing more than happy, healthy, and ordinary, little did they know the son that they were just about to have would not only be extraordinary, but would literally become something of legend. And after hours of torturous labor, this legend was born, with the official birthday of October 26, 1860, and the legal name of Frank Boardman Eaton. Although it was the alias he was given later in life that would become his globally recognized name. Frank was a normal and happy child. He enjoyed playing with his friends, he enjoyed time outside, and he particularly enjoyed spending quality time with his father, at least as much as he could get. At the age of 8, Frank and his family moved from Hartford, Connecticut down to Twin Mound, Kansas. And this move, unfortunately, was a turning point in Frank's life. Shortly after Frank and his family moved to Kansas, it was obvious they did not fit in. Frank's father was an abolitionist, although the city they moved to had a pretty strong Confederate population. And during this time, those two did not get along at all. Now, while Frank was initially upset about the move, he quickly made new friends in Kansas, and it almost seemed like his new home. Although, for Frank's parents, it was somewhat obvious that trouble was brewing. Although, they kept their fears away from Frank. That was until they couldn't anymore. Not even 1 year after moving to Kansas, Frank's father was shot dead in cold blood by 6 former Confederate soldiers. These former soldiers were part of a vigilante Southerners group who called themselves the Regulators, and they believed it was totally acceptable to use violence on your political enemies. The news of his father passing devastated both Frank and his mother. Frank's mother was concerned about how she would make ends meet and how she would take care of her boy on her own, and Frank had no idea what life would be like without his best friend. After the murder, many members of the community went to visit their new neighbors and pay their condolences. But it was one man who visited the family that left a particular impact on Frank. This man was named Moses Beeman. He was a friend of Frank's father, and he had one important message for Frank. During his visit, he took Frank in a separate room, sat him down, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the following. "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." He said nothing else to the 8-year-old child. He hugged his mother, and he left the house, leaving Frank with a heavy heart and a confused mind. The following week, Moses returned, although he didn't have an order. This time, he had an objective. He took Frank into the backyard, set up some cans on a fence post, and pulled out a gun. At this point, Frank had seen guns but was not familiar, and was more or less traumatized by the thought of handling a gun, due to how his late father died. Although Moses ensured it was okay and safe, and the two began to shoot. And from the age of 8 to 15, Frank, both with Moses and by himself, took shooting very seriously, and very quickly gained expert levels of marksmanship, with no formal training. At the age of 15, Frank decided that it was time to get formal training. He, although being young in modern standards, felt like a man at the time. He had been taking care of his mother for years now, and he felt like the time was right. Frank set out to visit Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. Although when Frank arrived at the fort, he was quickly turned away, being told he was too young to join the army. Feeling like it was too late to turn back, Frank felt desperate. And it was at that moment that he looked the colonel dead in the eyes and told him, "I know I can't join the army yet, but I just need to learn how to shoot. Please, even for a day, take me in. For all you know, I might even be a better shot than some of your soldiers." And while the colonel saw this as disrespect, he also saw this as a challenge. And he took Frank in to humble him. During his time in the fort, Frank reportedly outshot everybody in the fort, and even kept up with the top marksmen in the army. Frank stayed for much longer than he anticipated and participated in many shooting competitions at the fort. So many, in fact, that the commanding officer and that same colonel, John J. Coppener, gave Frank a marksmanship badge and also gave him the now legendary nickname of Pistol Pete. After spending years practicing at home and now having the affirmation of the government for being an extremely skilled marksman, Frank felt emboldened to act on the mission he was given as an 8-year-old boy. Remembering what Moses told him in the hours Moses spent with him, he knew what he had to do. And over the next decade, Frank hunted down and killed every single one of his father's murderers, except for one, who unfortunately passed away before Frank could get to him. After seemingly accomplishing his mission, Frank felt proud and once again lost, and he ended up settling in Oklahoma and decided to use his skills for good and became a sheriff and later a blacksmith. And he also went on to become married, have 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and even live long enough to see 3 of his great-great-grandchildren. Frank, or Pistol Pete, passed away on April 8th, 1958, at the ripe age of 97. And while he has been gone for decades now, his story is definitely still around. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest revenge stories of human history. But we're also just getting started. I don't know, I really wanted to start the story with Pistol Pete because I thought the story was so cool. You know, almost like a Batman vibe. Like, he was literally given the task as an 8-year-old boy, hey, you have to kill everybody who killed your father or you will be cursed. Like, that's a crazy thing to say to an 8-year-old, but he did it. He took it seriously, he learned marksmanship, he avenged his father, and then used his skills for good. But on top of just being a legend for that, Frank was also a legend for being very personable. And he was so personable and outgoing, in fact, that him riding a horse at a parade in 1923 is the reason why Oklahoma State University has the mascot of Pistol Pete. Students of what would later become Oklahoma State University literally saw Frank on a horse, being Frank and just doing outrageous things and being outgoing, and decided that this guy is the perfect representation of our school. And for that reason, they petitioned to change the mascot, and well, the rest is history. Because it wouldn't be until 1958 that a caricature of Frank known as Pistol Pete would become the official mascot. And the now iconic logo was not even a licensed symbol until the 1980s, obviously long after Frank passed away. Since Frank's passing, he has won multiple awards. Most notably, in 1997, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and in 2022, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma. And literally only last year, in 2025, he was also inducted into the Oklahoma State University Hall of Fame, further proving that Pistol Pete is a legend. And in Oklahoma, he is very much so appreciated. Frank had a normal upbringing, but because of unfortunate circumstances outside of his control, his father was taken from him and he was given a mission he would go on to fulfill and then live a long, prosperous life. Honestly, that's how you make lemonade out of lemons. But we're only just getting started and we have more stories to get into. The year is 963. Harold Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, and his wife were both awaiting the delivery of their son. Although this time, they weren't in a modest shack. They were in a quite luxurious castle. After hours of grueling labor and beating all odds, the queen survived, and the baby boy was born happy and healthy. And his name was Sweyn Forkbeard. Growing up as the son of the King of Denmark, Sweyn had a much different upbringing than most Danes. Sweyn was born into one of the most iconic bloodlines in all of Viking history, and it was for this reason that he had massive shoes to fill. Fortunately, due to his unique upbringing, he was exposed to knowledge and education that most Danes could never dream of, and it was this experience in his early life that set him up for success as a strong leader. Without having really any recorded facts of the upbringing of Sweyn, there's not much to report about his early life, besides the fact that it is very likely that he was exposed to warfare, strategy, and swordsmanship at a very young age, and this was proven later in life. As Sweyn began to develop from a young boy to a young man, he began to have more and more tension with his father, or at least his father figure, because it is believed that Harold Bluetooth is likely not the biological father of Sweyn, but more likely the stepfather, with the biological father being Harold's brother who passed away before Sweyn was ever born, marrying his brother's widow and taking on the child as his own. That, on a surface level, seems admirable, although, as we will go on to learn, this decision was likely his downfall. As Sweyn grew from a young boy to a young man, he felt he was ready to take on responsibility, and Sweyn approached his father, asking him for a piece of Denmark, something that he could own and rule and practice his kingsmanship in. Although Bluetooth denied the request, and Sweyn took this rejection as an act of war. Sweyn quickly decided that he only had one option if he truly wanted to gain power, and that was to take it. And shortly after this denial, he began gathering an army, telling Bluetooth that he was going to go on a raid at some point. However, in reality, the swords he was collecting were going to be pointed at his father. Now, the reason why Sweyn went to such extreme lengths to betray his father are debated, although it's not believed that he tried to overthrow his father simply just because he was denied land. It is believed that it was the combination of this land denial on top of another factor that caused, well, such a violent overthrowing, which we will discuss. Those two additional factors that are debated, well, are the following. Some believe that it was around this time where Sweyn found out that Bluetooth was not his true biological father, therefore emboldening him to overthrow Bluetooth because he was the true heir to the throne, not Bluetooth. And the other belief is that Sweyn simply did not like the Christianization of Denmark. And that's because Bluetooth was the first king of Denmark to be baptized and accept Christianity as the primary religion. Something that rubbed Sweyn the wrong way, because he held the pagan Viking traditions and beliefs closely to his heart. And his Christianization seemed like a betrayal. Unfortunately, we may never know what the true reasons were. Regardless, a large-scale battle took place. Bluetooth's army actually won the battle. However, Bluetooth sustained a massive injury during the battle and died shortly after. And because of this, Sweyn was now made the king of Denmark, supposedly at the age of 23. During Sweyn's time as the king of Denmark, he was involved in multiple large-scale historic battles, each of which are worthy of a video on their own. But to summarize the next few decades, Sweyn used his might and strategy to take over significant parts of Norway, so much to the fact that he actually became the king of Norway as well in the year 1999, and then set his sights on England. However, the English were not so happy to have the Danes on their land. And it was because of the English's disdain for the Danes in England that the King of England at the time, King Ethelred the Unready, ordered the massacre and mass murder of all of the Danes in England. This event was known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and it took place in November of 1002. This massacre was undoubtedly tragic for the Danes in England and their families back home. And one of the most notable individuals impacted by this massacre was Sweyn Forkbeard, because both his brother and sister were murdered in this massacre. And it was these exact murders that gave Sweyn the motivation and justification to let all hell break loose on England. And that he did. Sweyn was already occupying parts of England because of the prospect of revenue. Although now with this newfound justification, they wanted not just parts of England, they wanted to rule the entire country. And from the year 1002 to the year 1012, Sweyn engaged in 3 different full-scale battles on England. And by the end of the following year, 1013, Sweyn became the official King of England by means of conquest, making him the king of a 3rd consecutive country, the King of Denmark, the King of Norway, and now the King of England. And with the conquest of this final country, he was able to enact his revenge. Because although the King of England took a brother and a sister from Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn took the crown and the country from the King of England, something he likely planned on doing anyway. Although with this added motivation, I'm sure it made the revenge that much sweeter. The full detailed story of Sweyn Forkbeard is obviously something I can't go into in this video. Although I'm really hoping this brief summary gave a pretty good overlook on how one man could lose some siblings, but gain a country. Now, I'm definitely not going to say Sweyn seemed like an innocent, harmless individual. He was a ruthless ruler, and it appears he partook and engaged in some of the very much so common brutality of his day. Although, when a king decides it's acceptable to exterminate an entire group of people, there needs to be pushback. Unfortunately, the King of England just happened to mess with the wrong Viking. Now, I would be lying if I didn't tell the full story, because shortly after taking the crown in England, Sweyn did die. And he died, unfortunately, only 40 days after becoming the King of England, giving him only limited time to enjoy everything he had worked for. It's like they say, is it better to have loved and lost, or never loved at all? In my opinion, the story of Sweyn Forkbeard is so interesting. And the fact that he was the king of 3 countries at once, to me, is mind-blowing. And sure, the guy, overthrew his dad, or stepdad, we don't really know. But when somebody kills your brother and sister, either in law or by blood, taking that individual's crown and country in retaliation seems like pretty sweet revenge. And yet, there's still more to discuss. The year is 1783. 2 new American immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why baby boy is such a cliche in this video. I did not intend this. Regardless, 2 Irish-Scottish immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy. His name was Hugh, and he was about to become, once again, a legend. Hugh's early life is not necessarily well known, although he is extremely famous for what happened near the end of his life. In his early life, Hugh set out to become an explorer, and on one of his expeditions, he was actually essentially enslaved by pirates when his ship was overtaken by pirates, and he was given the ultimatum of either dying or becoming a pirate and fighting with them. He chose life and unfortunately spent multiple years as a pirate doing pirate things. On one of his missions, Hugh decided to ditch his pirate crew and spend time with some of the Native Americans that he had met in Texas. Now, he wasn't intentionally trying to be in Texas, the pirates were simply here, and he decided to just jump ship. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he had met were not fans of pirates whatsoever, and for this reason, he was sentenced to death almost immediately when meeting these natives. It has been reported that right before his execution by the natives, Hugh was able to offer these natives an expensive dye that they could use to dye garments and for war paints, and this was enough to spare his life. And because of this transaction, he was able to not only live, but spend the next couple of years living amongst this tribe, a time when he was able to hone in his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. After Hugh spent multiple years as a pirate and then multiple years as a tribesman, Hugh decided it was time for something new. And it was at this time that he left the group of natives he was living with and decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri in 1821. At this point, Hugh had been on this earth for nearly 40 years and had lived a full life for many up until this point. Although it was this move that he made to St. Louis that would truly cement Hugh Glass as a legend, at least in terms of revenge stories. The following year, after moving to St. Louis, Missouri, Hugh noticed an advertisement in the newspaper, the Missouri Gazette. The advertisement was commissioned by William Henry Ashley, and the advertisement was calling for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. And to Hugh, somebody who's lived a rather storied life up until this point, this career opportunity not only sounded exciting, but also seemed like something that was directly within his skill set. And so he decided to respond to the advertisement and get the job. Him and 99 other men, of course. The group of men that ended up getting hired for this position became known as Ashley's 100, which, if you ask me, kind of sounds like another crazy man's challenge, but we'll put that to the side. These Ashley's 100 were some of the most rugged and skilled mountain men that Missouri had to offer. And once the group was fully organized, the following year, they had started their expedition. An expedition that would be longer and harder than Glass could ever imagine. The expedition was almost instantly met with resistance from Native Americans. It was reported that the Americans tried to initiate trade, but were met with violence, which resulted in an all-out war against this native settlement and, well, these traveling traders. The result of this conflict was the entire village being burned down, everyone dying on the native side, and a vast majority of the Ashley 100 dying as well. Following this all-out war on the tribe, Hugh and 13 other men continued their journey to the Yellowstone River, where they intended to trap and fur beavers. To me, that fact alone is crazy, that they literally had a full-scale war during this expedition, and they, just continued to get beaver pelts of all things. Regardless, it wouldn't be this all-out war with the native tribes that would be the source of revenge. That betrayal and revenge would actually come from within the Ashley 100. Once Hugh and the 13 other men finally arrived in Yellowstone, the men split up and began looking for furs. And that was when Hugh stumbled upon an ominously quiet clearing right outside of a small creek. And this area, unfortunately, turned out to be a bear's nest and resulted in Hugh Glass being mauled by a bear severely. This angry, aggressive mother bear threw him to the ground and then pinned him down as she bit into Hugh, threw chunks of his meat to her cubs, and then her cubs also began to attack Hugh as well. To call this bear attack brutal is an understatement, and by the time that his fellow hunters and trappers were able to kill the bears, Hugh was essentially a shell of a man and wasn't even believed to be alive. Although, shockingly, upon further inspection, Hugh was breathing and somehow still alive. Although, just because he was alive now didn't mean he would be alive for long. And because of this, the other men put Hugh on a stretcher and began carrying him, assuming that they would carry him for the day, set up camp, sleep, and in the morning he would be dead and they could bury him. Although, after a day of carrying him, and then after sleeping through the night and finding him still alive, the group decided that it didn't make sense to carry him all the way home, because he obviously wouldn't survive. And the group decided to move on, but they did leave 2 people to watch over Hugh's body so that they could give him a proper burial once he did pass away. These 2 men, Fitzgerald, an older man, and Bridger, a younger boy, only a teen, both watched over Hugh for 5 consecutive days. And shockingly, Hugh survived every single one of those days. Although, to his team members, this was not a miracle. This was a liability, because these men were still in the middle of the wilderness, and they knew that they had bears and also angry native tribes on their tail. And these men were growing more anxious by the day. And it was on that 5th day that these men decided that they had to abandon Hugh. And that they did. They took his gun and everything of value off his person besides his clothes and left him to die by a creek. However, Hugh didn't die. And what he did next made him the legend that we likely are all familiar with today. And if you've seen the movie The Revenant, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Following being abandoned, Hugh surprisingly was able to come to and regained some form of consciousness, although his body was simply not cooperating. He had multiple broken ribs, a broken arm, a broken leg, and was truly in horrendous shape. However, he did have enough strength to drink water out of the stream, eat berries off of bushes, and gather enough nutrition to sustain himself. And with berries in his belly, he came to terms with the fact that he had been abandoned by his team. And with this realization, he became enraged. So enraged, in fact, that he decided that he would make it back to his camp and confront those men that abandoned him at any cost. And with that, he began the multiple 100-mile trek, starting with just crawling and eventually being able to hobble and walk the entirety of the way. After somehow surviving and maneuvering over 240 miles, Hugh reached a fur trading outpost where he was able to hitch a boat ride back to his original camp. And this was fortunate because this boat ride alone was an additional 300 miles, something that he likely would not have survived on foot. Regardless, after this boat ride, Hugh and the French fur traders he was with were attacked by another Native American tribe, although they were also defended by a separate Native American tribe. And the result of this all-out conflict was the death of everybody in Hugh's camp except for himself. And these Native Americans that saved his life and fought on his behalf, once again, delivered him directly to a separate trading post where he was offered the opportunity to rest, but he did not take it because he had not yet achieved his goal of getting his revenge. Now, mind you, this was 6 months after the bear attack at this point. Everybody who had ever known Hugh would have likely believed he was dead. Although, little did they know, Hugh was very much so alive, and the two men that abandoned him were about to get an earful, to say the least. Shortly after this encounter, Hugh finally made it to Fort Henry, the fort where his original company was supposed to be. And it was there where Hugh ran into Bridger, one of the two men that abandoned him. Although Bridger was not a man, he was a boy. And after Hugh talked to Bridger, he came to the conclusion that Bridger was a bystander. He was simply only following orders and did not intentionally betray Hugh. And because of this, after a harsh winter, Hugh decided to once again continue his journey to find Fitzgerald. He joined another mission to go 400 miles upstream to a new trading post where Fitzgerald was supposed to be, and he was well on his way to get his revenge. Although, once this boat had landed, it was once again attacked by another group of Native Americans. Most of his group died, and Hugh was once again left, I'm not even joking, to his own devices, where he was injured, alone, and had to walk hundreds of miles. After nearly a year of pain, torture, suffering, and, well, anger, Hugh was finally able to run into Fitzgerald at a settlement known as Fort Atkinson. However, at this fort, it was revealed that Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army. And if Hugh wanted to get revenge on Fitzgerald, it would be a death sentence, because killing a soldier was a crime punishable by execution. Although, I don't think Hugh needed to kill Fitzgerald to get his point across, because I'm sure for Fitzgerald, even seeing Hugh would have been shocking. But beyond just making his presence and, well, being alive known to Fitzgerald, Hugh also told Fitzgerald that while he can't kill him now, if he ever leaves the army, he will personally kill Fitzgerald. And while to some that may not sound like the most satisfying revenge, being able to come face to face to the man who abandoned you and not kill him, but to tell him, hey, I'm alive, I survived everything, and I'm not going to kill you. A, because I can't, but B, because you might have worse things coming to you. And while death is a harsh punishment, war is no walk in the park. And I would personally like to believe that being able to overcome and survive everything that Hugh did, coming face to face with the person that abandoned him and telling him off, and being the bigger man was likely the most satisfying thing he could have done in that situation. But for all I know, he could also have just been extremely mad that he was a soldier and was avidly waiting for him to, not be a soldier anymore so he could get his real revenge. But I'll leave that for you guys to decide in the comments. Regardless, hopefully this extremely oversimplified version of the story of Hugh Glass paints just a small picture of how much of a badass he truly was. And if you want to learn more about it, watch the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Or, if you want a more accurate depiction, read some historical documents. This guy went to hell and back multiple times and could never truly catch a break. Although he was able to survive seemingly the impossible, and he was able to come face to face with the man who left him for dead and tell him that he survived the impossible and that it was Fitzgerald's turn to survive war. Historical myths that turned out to be true. Viking soul swords. Despite what movies and video games may lead you to believe, we all know that defeating your enemies with a sword will not inherently make your sword stronger. Or will it? Hey, bro sauce, Brody here, and in today's video, we're discussing soul swords. Okay, fake beard and glasses aside, let's discuss what's going on here. For starters, the term soul swords is not historic or scientific. It's just a word I'm using to describe the phenomenon at play. Regardless, back in the early Iron Age in Scandinavia, right before the age of the Vikings, Scandinavian warriors had one big issue. Their weapons sucked. Specifically, the iron ones. And the biggest reason for that was because during this early iron era, a majority of the iron collected by the Scandinavians was bog iron. Bog iron is formed by bacteria in bogs that is oxidizing trace amounts of iron to gain energy. And in doing so, it would naturally concentrate the iron. And this concentration would actually allow it to be collected and then later smithed. Now, for me, this is super interesting because I had no idea that there was an organic way of farming iron without mining it. But for the Scandinavians, it wasn't so interesting or even beneficial. And that's because while bog iron was convenient, it was not strong. Bog iron, unsurprisingly, is very impure, and for that reason, soft when forged, meaning that the Scandinavians definitely had a disadvantage in battle. And the Scandinavians definitely weren't strangers to battle, but that's a different story. Now, the Scandinavians knew that there was a serious issue with their metal, but they didn't have a solution, until they realized that they were not using one of their most plentiful resources, the body of their enemies. And that's not a joke. Scandinavian blacksmiths theorized that potentially incorporating the bones of their dead enemies, or any dead person for that matter, could potentially transfer the spirit of that dead individual into that blade, causing it to be stronger and more durable. And this is where things get a bit interesting, because during this Scandinavian Viking time, they very much so believed that this process was in fact strengthening their swords. However, as history went on, there was a large gap of time between then and now where people simply believed that this was more of a folktale or potentially symbolic, and not really any true benefit to the sword. But interestingly, in recent years, it was actually discovered that no, the Vikings were onto something, although not in the way that they intended. You see, while the Scandinavians and Vikings were using the bones of their enemies, ancestors, and animals to spiritually fuse them to their swords to increase its power, in reality, what they were doing was actually creating a rudimentary form of steel. And the reason for this is because the bones that they were using contained carbon. Like all organic matter, carbon is present, and bones are no exception for that rule, which is why when bones were introduced into the forging process of these swords and weapons, the bog iron was literally being turned into an organic alloy due to this introduction of bones, which in a morbid way is kind of badass. But yeah, I wanted to put this entry first because I thought the timeline was so funny. The Scandinavians and Vikings had a very spiritual connection to their weapons, and for that reason, they literally wanted to infuse spirits and souls into them to increase their power. And while to them it was the souls that were adding the power, in reality it was the bones. But what's even more interesting is that down the line, when this practice was theorized and discovered, it was believed by historians and scientists that this was more or less symbolic and spiritual and had no real-world utility. And for that reason, the myth of these bones making the sword stronger was, well, a myth. That was until those same people took a closer look at the swords and realized that, wait, there's not a soul in this sword, but there is early steel. Like, I can only imagine being a scientist or historian in that room, looking at the sword and being like, oh, that's cute, look at them. They put bones on it because they thought it would be like, you know, soul-bound or something. That's funny. Oh my God, they made steel. And the myth of this bone forging process being beneficial was quickly realized to be fact, albeit in a roundabout way. But we're just getting started, so let's move on. Gladiator versus lion. There's honestly so much cool stuff to discuss when you're talking about gladiators. But when it comes to historical myths, one of the most prevalent was the fact, or myth, that they never actually fought animals. The whole gladiatorial games is a rabbit hole in itself, simply because there was so much variety in the types of games that were happening, some more unfair than others, and some didn't even involve gladiators in the first place. For example, in the Roman Colosseum, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for criminals to be subject not to death, but to a fight in the Colosseum against another criminal to the death, meaning that while it wasn't a death sentence, there was a likely chance that you would die. On top of this ancient version of bum fights, there was also literal naval battles that would take place in the Colosseum. Yeah, they would literally flood the place and have boats in there, which is just badass. And in other cases, they would have a criminal not fight another criminal, but fight a professional gladiator, which in that case was definitely a death sentence. And as we all know, gladiators also fought gladiators. But as some of you might not know, gladiators didn't always fight to the death. And it's been proven historically that professional gladiators were of high value to their investors. And while the fights were brutal, typically gladiatorial battles only had a 10 to 20% fatality rate, which is still insane, but that statistic is more like the now modern day knockout rate in the UFC, likely the modern day equivalent of the Roman Colosseum. Now, this is where things take a turn, because while all of the different types of battles that happened in the Colosseum were historically provable through artifacts and records, there was one sort of battle that was not proven until recently, and that was battles of gladiators fighting tigers. Now, this is interesting because there has long been records and specifically artworks found of gladiators depicted fighting big cats, specifically lions or tigers. But interestingly, there was never any historical evidence found of these matches actually happening. Which is why, for that reason, it was theorized that these artworks were more or less symbolic, showing the strength and the fearlessness of these gladiators, rather than them actually fighting lions and tigers, because, well, how would you even do that in the first place? But when you remember that you're discussing people that literally fit boats into the Colosseum, it's not hard to imagine they would find a way to get tigers involved as well. Although, I guess that thought wasn't in the mind of historians and archaeologists at the time, because while I'm sure they thought it was possible, they had no evidence to back up this claim. That was until recently. And when I say recently, I mean recently. The first article published proving the existence of human bones with animal bite marks in the Colosseum was published in 2025. Although in this article, it is stated that these bones were collected in the early 2000s. Unsurprisingly, the publishing of this article was significant because for the first time ever, we had genuine proof of animals fighting gladiators in the Colosseum, which is kind of surprising considering how much art there was depicting it. But I guess if this was so rare and so special back then, it's not hard to imagine why there would be so much art about it because, well, it was significant. Just think about it in a modern context. Nobody takes pictures of regular stuff. You only take pictures of important or significant things. Regardless, yeah, for the longest time, it was believed that while gladiators and the whole gladiatorial games in the Colosseum were interesting and, well, diverse, up until very recently, there was no proof that they were fighting lions or any big animals. That was until last year when it was proven, because they found a skeleton of a likely 20-year-old man with a tooth mark in his skull and pelvis. And this tooth mark, according to archaeologists, is unmistakably the tooth mark of either a tiger or a lion. Once again, making a historic myth actually fact. The mythical gorilla. If I were to describe a mythical creature to you that was tall, hairy, muscular, and had big teeth, what would you assume I was talking about? Maybe Bigfoot? Maybe Sasquatch? Maybe even a woolly mammoth? But what if I were to tell you that the mythical creature I was describing was actually a gorilla? That's right. Up until surprisingly recently, the concept of a gorilla in the Western world was not something of fact, and it was believed that stories of gorillas were folktales, describing some sort of mythical creature. And while gorillas are definitely mythical in their own regard, they themselves also prove that sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Let me explain. Now, it's important to note that gorillas obviously were known to people who lived around them. Anybody who lived in the area where gorillas were native were not shocked by them existing. They were simply a creature in their habitat. They were neighbors, essentially. Although, in the Western world, gorillas were something that could not even be fathomed, which is once again why they were presumed to be mythical rather than potentially something unseen. One of the earliest recorded accounts of somebody from the Western world describing a gorilla come from an English traveler named Andrew Battle. He lived from 1565 to 1614, and his story is, well, interesting to say the least, but that's a topic for another video. During his travels, Andrew ran into a rather interesting creature that he called Pongo. And the mention of this Pongo creature is, as I stated, one of the first ever recorded mentions of the existence of the gorilla. This is an actual quote from Andrew Battle describing the Pongo creature. This Pongo is in all proportion like a man, but he is more like a giant in stature than a man, for he is tall, and hath a man's face, hollowed eyes, and long hair upon his brows. His face and ears are without hair, and his hands also. His body is full of hair, but not thick, and it is a Danish color. He goeth a ways upon his legs, and carries his hands clasped on the nape of the neck. When he goeth upon the ground, they go many together, and kill many that trail in the woods. Those Pongo are never taken alive, because they are so strong, that 10 men cannot hold one of them. That description, albeit long, is interesting and relatively detailed, and coming from a, well, potentially reputable source, it's interesting that even this was written off. Although with no point of reference and this guy literally being held in captivity in Africa, it's potentially reasonable to assume he either hallucinated something or saw something he really didn't, or, well, who knows? Regardless, this account from the early 1600s was the first and really last for a very long time. Which brings us all the way to the 1800s. That's right, over 200 years of gorillas being, well, misunderstood and assumed to be mythology. That was until physician and naturalist Thomas Savage obtained several gorilla bones, including skulls. And with these new discoveries, he wrote his first formal description of this newly discovered animal known as a gorilla. Now, Thomas Savage was actually a wealthy physician from America. He went to Yale Medical School and received his degree in 1833. And interestingly, in 1836, he even became a priest as well. So this man was busy. And because this man was both a priest and a doctor, he was sent as a medical missionary to Africa, specifically Liberia. And it was during his time in Liberia where he was able to acquire the skull and bones of the species that at the time was unknown. That was until he gave it the name that is, well, now famous. Now, the story doesn't end there because we still don't know everything about it, and there is still no, well, visitation of gorillas from experts. Although I do use that term a bit lightly. Introducing Paul de Chaillu, and he was a French-American traveler and zoologist. And he is famous for being the first Westerner to confirm the existence of gorillas. Paul, similar to Thomas, spent time in Africa, although Paul spent time in Africa slightly after Thomas, and what he did was vastly different. Because Paul was not collecting bones in Africa, he was actively killing and sending gorilla bodies back to Europe, and was also actively trying to capture baby gorillas, although unsuccessfully. Paul wasn't doing this out of the goodness for his heart, however, and he was actively selling gorilla bodies to the Natural History Museum in London, where all world artifacts seem to end up, apparently. And as I mentioned, he actively tried to capture many baby infant gorillas, but said that they were too, quote, ill-tempered and they all died within his captivity. On top of this, Paul also sold cannibal skulls found from native tribes in Africa to Europeans as well, which seems less about science and more about money, but that's beyond the point. Regardless, it wasn't until the 1860s that it was proven as a fact that gorillas were actual creatures and not mythical creatures just made up by African tribes. Which is a bit ironic considering they literally had European travelers who described seeing these creatures as well, but, well, we'll ignore that. But yeah, up until the 1860s, most Europeans likely have never even heard of a gorilla. And if they did, they assumed it was just some sort of outlandish creature. That was until somebody decided to go, kill them, and send them home for money. But at least with that, we did have the European discovery of the gorilla, proving this myth to be fact. But in case that wasn't interesting enough, check this out. At least in a European context, the discovery of dinosaurs just slightly predates the discovery of gorillas, which if you think about it is insane. Because how do you discover something that lived millions of years before your time, before you discover something that is actively walking the earth and you are actively being told about from native tribes in Africa? Now that I think about it, this entire section kind of makes me feel like European travelers didn't really respect the locals. But what do I know? The golden sheepskin. Greek mythology undoubtedly has some of the coolest imagery and lore when it comes to, well, mythology. However, not all of this mythology is all myth, and some of it actually has genuine roots in history. One notable story from Greek mythology describes something known as the Golden Fleece. It is a legendary artifact that essentially came from a divine flying golden ram, and this ram was essentially a symbol of divine favor and kingship. Now, within the story of the Golden Fleece, there is a man named Jason. He was on a quest to claim his rightful throne, and in this pursuit, he made it his mission to retrieve this Golden Fleece of this mythic, mysterious, and, well, divine ram. And long story short, not to spoil it, but he slays the impossible to slay dragon and retrieves the Golden Fleece. The story is obviously more detailed than that, but I'm just giving a trust me bro summary. Now, let's separate fact from fiction. In this story, Jason travels to a city called Colchis, which is in modern-day Georgia, which is a relevant fact. And while Jason may have never existed, and while the whole golden ram may have also never existed, and I can pretty confidently say there probably wasn't a dragon around either, there is one thing that is very likely a real artifact, that being the Golden Fleece. And the reason I say this is because in Georgia specifically, the location where the story took place, it is not uncommon for gold deposits to wash downstream from mountains in certain waterways. But of course, that's not all. On top of gold literally just washing down the river, there is evidence to suggest that farmers at the time who lived in these regions would use sheepskins from their animals to collect these gold nuggets heading downstream. doing essentially an early version of gold prospecting. But this is where things get interesting, because although people are still doing this in modern-day Georgia, it is believed that this tradition has been passed down through thousands of years, meaning that it is more likely than not that during the time of the story of the Great Fleece, people were using sheepskins to collect gold, literally creating their own golden fleece, leading some historians and experts to believe that this practice and this artifact wasn't just pure myth and actually had a strong basis in, well, reality. And while this artifact alone may be the only piece of fact from the mythology, it's still interesting to see that even some of the largest mythological stories still have a kernel of truth. And it's also cool to kind of imagine the first person who saw, a sheep pelt drying out with some gold on it to be so inspired that they write some crazy lore around it. This is kind of the equivalent of somebody just seeing a stick poking out of the ground and then writing Star Wars. The Puukai. If you thought the United States had the biggest, strongest, and freest eagles, you would be sorely mistaken, because New Zealand actually takes that record. The Puukai is a mythological creature, and it's referred to as a monstrous bird in Maori mythology. The Maori people are believed to be some of the first people to have ever settled in New Zealand, and their history in New Zealand is vast and runs deep. And an interesting part of their story in New Zealand is their mythology, specifically the Puukai. You see, in Maori mythology, the Puukai is a bird that is so massive and so strong that it could pick up and kill a man with ease. And for that reason, this was a mythological creature that was terrifying, and definitely not something to mess with. It was typically seen or used as a cautionary tale, but also sometimes as a symbol of strength. It is believed that the Maori people arrived in New Zealand sometime around the 1400s. And from the 1400s to the mid-1700s, the Maori people remained uncontacted in New Zealand, until they gained contact with European travelers in the late 1700s. Prior to the Maoris' contact with the Europeans, they did not have a formal writing system, which means that they relied on oral storytelling to have some sort of record of their people's history, which is a big reason why they had so much lore and such cool stories. But obviously, when a majority of your historical records come from oral accounts, you're basically playing a big game of telephone, and it's hard to tell fact from fiction. And such is the case with the Puukai, because for many, the existence of the Puukai seems, well, too crazy to be true, not only to the Europeans, but also to younger Maori generations. Regardless, that didn't stop the Maori people from continuing the traditions and telling the story of the Puukai. But that doesn't mean that they never existed. Enter the Haast eagle. You see, the Haast eagle is an extinct species of eagle that lived specifically in New Zealand at the exact same place where the Maori people lived. Interestingly as well, the Haast eagle is also the largest known eagle to have ever existed, and it's believed that they weighed anywhere from 22 to 40 pounds and preyed almost exclusively on a bird named moa, which is essentially just an extinct 500-pound variant of the modern-day ostrich. It's believed by researchers that the Haast eagle got to the size it did because it had no natural predators and had seemingly an endless amount of prey, allowing it to evolve and grow uninterrupted. That was until some people came to the island of New Zealand, specifically the Maori people. You see, it's believed that the Haast eagle officially went extinct in 1445, and experts say they went extinct because after the Maori people reached the island of New Zealand only years prior, they were able to hunt the Mau bird to extinction. And with the Mau birds being the primary prey of the Haast eagle, it's not hard to understand how the Haast eagle went extinct after its entire food supply was shut off. And this is really where things get interesting, because if you remember, the Puukai, as described by the Maori people, is a large, monstrous bird that could easily pick up and kill a human man. And as we know, the Haast eagle lived in the same place as the Maori people for a short amount of time, as well as the fact that the Haast eagle also preyed on animals that were literally 500 pounds, meaning that if they could take on that flightless bird, they could probably take on a human, or at least a child at that. And considering the fact that the Maori people were literally devastating the Haast eagle's food supply, it's not hard to imagine that the Haast eagles could either be desperate or just straight up mad that these newfound humans in their ecosystem are messing everything up, potentially triggering some Haast eagle attacks, or Puukai attacks. And while for hundreds of years the story of the Puukai may have seemed like mythology to the Maori people and the Europeans they encountered, when the existence of the Haast eagle was discovered in 1871, the dots were slowly connected, and it was eventually revealed that the Puukai was not any sort of mythical creature. It was very much so real, but unfortunately never lived long enough to tell its side of the story. Speaking of telling stories, if you like the way I tell stories and want to see more cool stories every single Friday, feel free to be a bro and subscribe to the channel. We're currently on the road to 2 million subscribers, and like I said, we post cool videos every single Friday. And I guess while I'm shilling, if you're enjoying this video about myths that actually turned out to be true and want to see a part 2, all you need to do is either leave a like on this video or comment part 2 so I know that you guys actually want more of this. But now that you're subscribed and have liked the video, let's move on to the final entry on this list. Ancient ozone. I would assume, or at least hope, that everybody watching this video now is familiar with the ozone layer. You know, the protective layer that is literally protecting everybody watching this video right now from the harmful radiation of the sun and space. And while the ozone layer is definitely the GOAT of protecting us from harmful space rays, it actually existed in mythology far before it existed in the scientific world. You see, the ozone layer was officially discovered in 1913 by French physicists Charles Fabry and Henry Boysen, and that discovery was significant. But what if I told you that not just 100 years ago, but thousands of years ago, the concept of an ozone layer was already theorized and well established in the world of mythology? Let me explain. Norse mythology, like Greek mythology, like Scandinavian mythology, runs deep. But one interesting part of Norse mythology I wanted to focus in on is known as Svalin. And in Norse mythology, Svalin is literally a legendary shield that stands in front of the earth and the sun. And its sole purpose is to protect the world from overheating. It's believed that the myth of Svalin dates back all the way to the Bronze Age. And interestingly, the word Svalin itself is actually a translation for the word cold or chill, meaning that Svalin was literally a chill guy. Jokes aside, there's not much known about where this mythology actually stemmed from, although it's interesting how, well, accurate it actually was. Now, whether or not this Nordic mythology from the Bronze Age was actually onto something, or it was just, well, sheer coincidence, the similarities are glaring, which is why I wanted to add it for that reason. Because obviously the definition of Svalin is strictly mythical, the concept of what Svalin represents is definitely not myth and very much so reality. And while it took until 1913 for physicists to discover the ozone layer, for Nordic storytellers, they were able to theorize the ozone layer with no proof before they ever even discovered iron. That's pretty cool. Crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Project Hemisphere. If you're watching this video, you likely know what a wiretap is, right? Maybe you watched a movie about mafia bosses or drug lords and the police are trying to get information on them and they tap their phone. That's a real thing, and in those situations, that's a useful tool. But what if I told you the American government actually had a partnership with the third largest cell provider in all of the United States to track all of their customers' data? Well, hopefully you'd believe me, because it's true, and it's called Project Hemisphere. In 2007, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the ONDCP, started a partnership with the cell phone provider AT&T, the third largest cell provider in the entire United States. And this partnership was for profit, meaning that the US government was not only gaining access to all of AT&T's data, which we'll get into exactly what that contains, but they are literally selling the information directly to the United States government. But this isn't just a high-level operation. Sheriff's offices and police departments across all of the United States each individually pay anywhere from $1 million per year plus to maintain access to all of AT&T's records. And they're paying this much because obviously this information is valuable to the authorities. But there's a lot of questions. How long has this been going on? What do they use this information for? What information do they get access to? And is this legal, and did anybody even agree to this? Let me answer all of those questions in that order. Project Hemisphere as a project dates back all the way back until 1987, with the US government using other methods to collect data based off of telephone conversations, likely partnering with other landline and communication companies of the time. And while AT&T only became part of Project Hemisphere during 2007 and was exposed in 2013, there is absolutely no information pointing towards AT&T ending or planning on ending this partnership anytime soon, if at all. After Project Hemisphere was widely exposed, there was a leaked document that showed exactly how sneaky AT&T was. And the contract between the government agency buying the data and AT&T goes as follows. The government agency agrees not to use the data as evidence in any judicial or administrative proceedings unless there is no other available and admissible probative evidence. The government agency shall make every effort to ensure the information provided by the contractor is non-attributable to AT&T if the data is provided to a third party. That is a direct quote, and also just a small snippet of part of the contract between these government agencies and AT&T. And what it basically says is, you didn't buy this from us and you don't even know where this came from. They essentially wanted to separate the AT&T brand as much as possible from the data that they were selling to the government. And while Project Hemisphere is still technically, officially secret, all information used in court filings, case reports, and other documents involving Project Hemisphere are cited described as information obtained from an AT&T subpoena, which on paper made it look like the government forced AT&T to give up the data on this one specific situation, but in reality, they were paying for it all along. And AT&T was more than willing to not only give access to their data, but to sell everybody's data to any government agency that was willing to pay. Now, what exactly did the government want to use this data for? In 2013, after Project Hemisphere was officially exposed, different law enforcement agencies made it seem like they were only using this to specifically find people that were involved in high-level drug-related activities. But through some of the available information during the initial expose in 2013, it was proven that they were also looking into other non-drug related crimes, such as bomb threats, impersonating military generals, organized crime, and other crimes of the sort. But they were all crime related. Now the question remains, what do they even have access to? What data is AT&T collecting, storing, and selling? And the simple answer is everything, always, and forever. The longer answer is AT&T specifically collects and stores metadata related to every single call that happens on any part of their infrastructure. And this metadata includes the phone numbers that called each other, who these people are, the date of these phone calls, the length of these phone calls, when these phone calls took place, where these people were when they took place of these phone calls, text messages, voicemails, and anything else that AT&T has access to, they are collecting, storing, and selling to the US government. And I guess the final question is this even legal? And that's where we are today. As I mentioned, this project is still technically officially secret, although at this point, it's not a secret at all. And with this information being known and well exposed and relatively well discussed, there is significant legal and privacy concerns surrounding this entire operation. But nothing is formally being done. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if this is legal or not. But even if it's not, it's going to take a lot of force to make anything change. In November of 2023, U.S. Senator Ronald Lee Wyden addressed the U.S. General Attorney Merrick Garland and called for the release of additional information regarding Project Hemisphere. And in this letter from this U.S. Senator, he expressed his massive concern for the legality of this operation that was currently ongoing, and how they were able to conduct such extensive searches of domestic phone records without any need for a warrant. Which is true. Like I said, if you are using AT&T right now, any government agency that is currently paying for access to the database can access anything you've ever done on the AT&T ecosystem. Calls, texts, voicemails, anything. And as of the legality, people are definitely curious and concerned, but nothing's being done as of yet. So this conspiracy is still ongoing and developing, so maybe in a future episode I'll follow up. I think in this day and age, it's pretty well assumed that the government has access to any piece of information they could possibly ever want or need. And even if they don't have direct access to it, they could get it relatively quickly. And Project Hemisphere is just proof of that. And for some people, this may not seem shocking at all. Although in 2013, when this was first exposed, I'm sure this was a rather alarming revelation. And on top of that, to discover that this has been going on since 1987 is definitely enough to make you raise an eyebrow. Of course, you could say, why worry if you have nothing to hide? But at the same token, there is definitely a violation of privacy happening here. Like, if the government subpoenaed AT&T about a specific court case that is actively ongoing, that's one thing, and that's a different conversation. But any government agency or police unit being able to pay to have access to essentially everybody's phone records is an entirely different situation. If nothing else, it's interesting to think about. Because if you are an American taxpayer and also a customer of AT&T, you are essentially paying for the people who are spying on you to spy on you by providing them your information that you pay for. It's kind of like hiring a private investigator and being like, hey, I'm going to pay you to follow me around, and also here's a tracking device that I'm just going to put in my pocket. Use it to track me at any time, and I'm going to pay for all of this. But with that being said, this is only the first entry on this list. So let's keep going. Operation Snow White. The Church of Scientology is likely the most famous cult in all of human history. They've got a massive headquarters in Los Angeles, not to mention their alleged 11,000 locations worldwide, a very wealthy, powerful, and influential member base, and likely one of the most controversial rises and existences in modern-day religion. In modern times, the Church of Scientology is known for being that place that Tom Cruise goes to and for helping skateboard YouTubers ruin their career. But did you also know that in the 1970s, the Church of Scientology carried out the largest infiltration of the US government in all of American history? Well, they did. And they did it successfully. But let me give a bit of background. The Church of Scientology was founded in 1952 by L. Ron Hubbard, a man who had just published a successful book and then lost the rights to it after a bankruptcy. Obviously, if you're an author who just had a wildly successful book and then somehow fumbled it all, of course you don't write another book, you start a religion. And in 1957, Scientology was granted tax exemption by the IRS because the IRS had officially recognized Scientology as a church. But a decade later, in 1967, the IRS decided that that wasn't true anymore, and that the Church of Scientology wasn't actually a church. It was a lot of things, and primarily acted as a business, and for that reason, needed to pay taxes. And this made L. Ron very upset. Losing their tax-exempt status wasn't the only interaction that Scientology had with the government, but it was definitely the most most alarming to L. Ron Hubbard. Around this time as well, the FBI was also periodically checking in on Scientology just to see what they were up to. And in 1963, they were even raided by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, obviously, if the government is telling you that what you're doing is not what a church is supposed to be doing, and that you're being investigated and literally raided by multiple different government agencies, obviously you're going to make the necessary changes to maintain your tax-exempt status and act more accordingly to how a religious nonprofit should act, right? Well, of course not. And Scientology's rebuttal to the government making them pay taxes again was Operation Snow White. In 1966, a year before Scientology officially lost their tax-exempt status, L. Ron Hubbard had officially organized the Guardian's Office, which was a subgroup within Scientology that was specifically meant to carry out Operation Snow White. Now, the natural next question is, what is Operation Snow White? And bluntly put, it was Scientology's effort to remove any negative documentation about Scientology within the US government. Any document, any file, any report, anything within the US government that mentioned anything about Scientology that was even remotely negative, keep in mind, not even false, just remotely negative, was a target of Operation Snow White. And the goal was to have these files, documents, or reports stolen, destroyed, or at the very least, removed. And while this was happening officially in 1966, as early as 1960, L. Ron Hubbard was beginning to encourage members to take up jobs at the government, specifically as secretaries or bodyguards or janitors, any job that could get a member of Scientology within the United States government. Obviously, to exploit that power, but we'll get into that. Before Scientology was able to implant their own members into the United States government, they had to work with people that were already there. And that's where Michael Meisner and Gerald Wolfe come in. In 1973, both of these men worked for the IRS as typists, and they specifically worked in the Department of Religious Tax Exemption, a perfect connection for Scientology. These men were infiltrated by Scientology and began making illegal copies to provide to Scientology to provide them with more information and context about how the system worked. But this quickly led to forgery and literal breaking and entering within the United States government offices. This relationship had been going on for years, and the infiltration of the United States government by the Church of Scientology was growing. And because of this, L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology as a whole was getting concerned that their in at the government could potentially turn on them. And because of this, the Church of Scientology kidnapped Michael Meisner and kept him in captivity, where he was literally imprisoned by the Church of Scientology to ensure that he would not rat on the Church of Scientology and spill the beans about Operation Snow White. After 3 months of captivity, Meisner was able to escape the Church of Scientology, contact the FBI, turn himself in, and tell them everything. And this breakthrough was catastrophic for the Church of Scientology, as it led to the biggest FBI raid in all of United States history, with 156 FBI agents raiding the Los Angeles Scientology office. And during this raid, they found everything that they were looking for. Stolen documents, forged documents, fake passports, fake IDs, fake FBI IDs, fake security badges, lock-picking tools, wiretaps, plans, internal documents, basically everything they needed to prove not only the existence, but the step-by-step plan and execution of Operation Snow White. One of the most insane findings about this entire raid was the fact that at its peak, Operation Snow White had likely up to 5,000 undercover agents infiltrating the United States government in one way, shape, or form. They were in or had access to at least 136 organizations within the United States government, including the IRS, the DEA, the Coast Guard, and so on, and had installed wiretaps and stolen documents from essentially every person working within the United States government that had anything to do with Scientology or tax exemption. The sheer depth that Scientology was able to penetrate within the United States government is insane. And it wasn't just the United States government that they were able to penetrate. These 5,000 spies that they had were across the globe, working within the government agencies across the globe as well to maintain their tax-free status and, most importantly, their good name in numerous countries around the world. In 1979, when Operation Snow White was fully exposed and fully ended, L. Ron Hubbard's wife and 10 other Scientologists were sentenced to 5 years in prison, which to me seems light considering the complexity of the situation, but that's irrelevant. And L. Ron Hubbard himself was actually never formally charged and spent the rest of his life after Operation Snow White in hiding. Operation Snow White is definitely interesting, and I think the only operation I've touched on so far that involves a private organization conducting a covert operation on the government. But yeah, the Church of Scientology really didn't want to pay taxes. And they didn't want to pay taxes so much that they were willing to essentially infiltrate the United States government to make sure that that didn't happen. And for a long time, they did so successfully. And as crazy as that is, we still have more to cover. The Zimmerman Telegram. There's no doubt that in modern times, the United States and Mexican border definitely have some tension. And the history of this tension goes back all the way into the 1800s, when Mexico lost a significant amount of land to the United States, specifically Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, which Mexico had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. Following that war, Mexican and American tensions were understandably at an all-time high, and these tensions from the mid-1800s bled into the early 1900s. And it was during the early 1900s when an opportunistic Germany had an idea. In 1917, Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, sent a secret diplomatic message directly to the German ambassador in Mexico and the Mexican president. And this secret telegram was short, concise, and if left unfound, would have changed the course of history forever. And I'll explain what I mean by if left unfound. But the telegram went as follows. We make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. We make war together, we make peace together. And the telegram included some more information, but this was the most significant sentence in the entire telegram. Previous to this telegram being sent, German officials had been spending time in Mexico, building a relationship and bonding with Mexico over their disdain and distrust for America. In Germany's eyes, this gave the two countries not only something in common, but also a common enemy. And even if Mexico didn't really trust or like Germany, Germany at least knew that Mexico didn't trust or like the United States, and they could use that. Hence, this proposal. The proposal specifically wanted Mexico to invade the United States. Obviously, Germany would be joining and supporting them in this invasion, and through this invasion, Germany promised Mexico that if they were successful, Germany would give Mexico all of their lost land back. Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico would all be Mexican land again if they were willing to help Germany invade United States soil. Now, Germany didn't necessarily want to just take over the United States, but they did want to distract them, because World War I was brewing in Europe, and the last thing that Germany wanted was America getting involved on European soil. They had enough to deal with. So they figured if Mexico could distract America, Germany could focus on Europe. However, there's a reason why this never happened, and it's not because Mexico didn't want to. Truthfully, we don't know whether they wanted to or not, because they never got the opportunity to execute on this plan. This specific telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico was intercepted by British intelligence, as they had been monitoring all of Germany's communications for this specific reason. And at first, it was reported that the British government didn't exactly know what to do about this information, because although they wanted to inform the United States about this plan as soon as possible, they also didn't want to give up too early the fact that they were spying on the German communications, because that would obviously cut off their supply of communication and lessen their intelligence, which obviously was not strategic. And after only a few weeks of planning a methodical way of releasing this information without giving up their secrets, the cat was out of the bag. And in February of 1917, the United States public was made aware of the Zimmermann telegraph. This information changed the course of history, because during this time, the American people had largely supported neutrality within this war. But once it was abundantly clear that America was a direct target of Germany, the American people definitely saw the situation over in Europe much differently. And with growing public pressure from the telegram being leaked and Germany continuing to use unrestricted submarine warfare, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, decided to declare war on Germany in April of 1917, officially getting the United States involved in World War I. So yeah, the Zimmermann telegram is a crazy story for multiple reasons. Firstly, because Germany just had such a devious plan to attack and distract the United States using Mexico as a proxy, and also the fact that one telegram being intercepted by British intelligence literally changed the course of history by preventing this attack and also getting the United States involved in World War I. And it's also a bit ironic too, because the entire reason for the Zimmermann telegram was to keep the United States out of World War I happening over in Europe. And because of this interception and this proposed attack directly on the United States, it backfired on Germany completely and got the United States directly involved in the war. To me, this is such an interesting piece of history, and it was something I knew nothing about in regards to World War I. And for that reason, I knew I had to add it to this list. But if you can believe it, we've still got more ground to cover. So let's keep moving. The US government helping Saddam Hussein. When you hear the name Saddam Hussein, the first thing you probably think is public enemy of the United States, not necessarily ally of the United States. However, both of those statements are technically true, depending on the time frame. During the 1990s and 2000s, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein was an enemy and a target of the United States government. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But did you know that before he became such this large public enemy, the US government was actually directly supporting Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988? To be very clear, they weren't necessarily on good terms, but it was definitely a situation of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. During the late 70s and early 80s, the US government viewed Saddam's regime as beneficial pushback to Iran's growing influence after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which literally overthrew the US-backed Shah and replaced him with an anti-American Islamic government. Once again, we're talking about another situation where a government is taking advantage of another country's political unease. Iran and Iraq were at war, and the US was definitely not happy with Iran because they had literally just had their US-backed government overthrown by an anti-American government, and for that reason, the US was rather keen to help Iraq defeat Iran, even if they weren't necessarily friends. One of the biggest aids provided to Iraq by the United States government was satellite imagery. The United States had satellite imagery of Iran's military building up specific military bases that were near and likely to invade vulnerable or unprotected parts of Iraq. But the US government didn't only just provide Iraq with military intelligence and satellite images. They also provided weapons and materials that were used to develop chemical weapons. Chemical weapons that Saddam used against Iranian troops and even civilians. Now, a different conspiracy within this conspiracy was whether or not the American government knew that Iraq was using the materials provided by the United States government to create chemical weapons. That was until declassified documents revealed that the US government were well aware that Iraq was committing war crimes via the materials they were providing them, but decided that they were just going to ignore the war crimes because Saddam at this point was being a useful ally by attacking and fighting Iran. But everything began to change in 1990 after the Iran-Iraq war, because in 1990, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait, which directly threatened the US, specifically through their oil interests that they had in the Persian Gulf at the time. This attack almost instantly made the US government shift its stance on Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and they began to label him a dictator who needed to be removed. And a year later, in 1991, the Gulf War began. And in 2003, after a decade of sanctions, the US invaded Iraq and executed Saddam Hussein. And just goes to show that just because you and someone else have a common enemy doesn't necessarily mean that you guys are on the same page. And the same weapons that the US government provided to Iraq to fight Iran were also used to fight Kuwait, which directly negatively impacted the US government. And obviously, in this situation, the US was fine with war crimes as long as you're on their side. But if you're gonna mess up their oil connections, you're gonna have a serious problem. For some of my older viewers, this may or may not be news to you. However, for a majority of my younger following, or for people who didn't have the full story about this entire conflict, I thought that this tidbit about America helping Saddam Hussein was definitely an interesting piece of American history. And yet, we're still not done yet. Before we get to the last entry in this list, I just need to say, if you guys are enjoying the series about crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, please leave a like or leave a comment letting me know that you want me to continue this series. Ironically, some of your guys' favorite videos are some of YouTube's least favorites, specifically the conspiracy and drug series. However, I will continue to make them as long as you guys continue to support and want them. My ultimate goal is to give you guys exactly what you want. And as long as I know that you guys want this content, I'll continue to make it for you. Your guys' support really means a lot, and I take your feedback seriously. But with that being said, let's get to the final entry on this list. Walt Disney working for the FBI. Walt Disney is one of the most famous people of all time, and there is a ton of conspiracies surrounding Walt Disney. And I think we've even discussed the whole him freezing his body thing in a different video. But this true conspiracy actually has nothing to do with that, and has everything to do with his involvement with the FBI, which to this day still is one of the more secret and ominous things about his personal life. When discussing the thoughts, opinions, or beliefs of Walt Disney, there's a lot to bring up, and a lot of assumption and skepticism. But one thing that was absolutely confirmed was Walt Disney's absolute disdain for communism and anything that was anti-capitalist. Coincidentally, during this time, the US government had the exact same thought, and this was prompted by the Red Scare, which was essentially the government's fear of communist ideals or beliefs or influence gaining popularity or taking place on American soil. And because Walt Disney and the United States government were both on the same page and both extremely powerful, in the 1950s, they decided to form a partnership. Walt Disney specifically acted as a confidential informant for the FBI, and his role was interesting to say the least. Now I have to make a distinction here because this video is conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. So I kind of have to separate fact versus, well, still conspiracy based off of information that are not yet proven yet. So let me quickly give you everything that is certifiably true right now. There is a declassified FBI document known simply as Walt Disney's name, Walter Elias Disney. And this document contains over 570 pages of information, including Walt Disney's connection to the FBI. However, most of this information is either redacted or still classified. What wasn't redacted and is currently confirmed is the following. Walt Disney granted the FBI to use the Walt Disney parks however they pleased for whatever reason they may want. And in the same agreement, the FBI offered Walt Disney to use FBI offices for whatever he may need, Not with the same unrestricted access, but there was access involved. One of the proposed uses was allowing Walt Disney to film the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse within the FBI offices, which to me seems strange because if you have Disneyland, you likely have the capability to film some sort of soundstage or film studio. But regardless, if you wanted to film within FBI offices, I suppose that's your right. In October of 1947, Walt Disney did testify in front of the House Un-American Activity Committee, a committee that specifically investigated communist happenings on American soil at the time. Obviously, about communistic concerns he had observed. I mention this because this is a documented fact and also gives more weight to what I'm about to discuss, which leads into the realm of uncertainty and possible conspiracy. So stepping out of the facts, it is claimed that from 1940 all the way up until 1966, at the year of his death, Walt Disney was directly involved with the FBI, which was confirmed that he was at least somewhat involved as an informant. But it is also believed that Walt Disney was specifically using his connection and authority within Hollywood to essentially report on individuals in Hollywood who were suspected of having either communist ties, beliefs, or had ideals that they were looking to influence or share with others, typically through media. In our last video too, we talked about how at this same time, during the second Red Scare, the US government was also publicly discrediting people that were outspoken about their communistic views, with the government aiming to discredit these people so people wouldn't believe them and start to also agree with communism. That operation was known as COINTELPRO, and I actually talked about it in my last video. So this one is kind of debatable because I'm talking about a lot of things that actually aren't proven true, but I think the story is worth mentioning, and there is obviously truth that is currently publicly available, and I think it sparks an interesting conversation. At the very least, provably, Walt Disney was involved with the FBI, and depending on who you talk to, there's a whole slew of other thoughts of what else was going on there. But I think the story definitely holds a bit of weight considering the time where this took place and what the government was actively doing at this time with COINTELPRO. So like I said, because this is a video about true conspiracies, let's just say that the conspiracy was that Walt Disney let the FBI use his parks. And in that case, that's a completely true conspiracy, and Walt Disney did give the FBI access to use the park however they saw fit, if they absolutely needed to. But everything else I did mention, as I'm clearly outlining once again, is still kind of up in the air. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it added a lot of interesting detail to the situation. Crazy missing persons cases that are still unsolved. Kenneth Lee Veatch was born in Clark County, Las Vegas in 1967. He was always drawn to the nature that surrounded him, and throughout his adolescence into his adulthood loved anything that involved being outside and experiencing nature. Kenneth, or Kenny, was actually so passionate about his outdoor excursions that he had an entire YouTube channel dedicated to documenting his adventures, as well as his inventions, with the channel being named Snakebit McGee. The channel still exists to this day and has 73,000 subscribers, and it currently has 5 videos posted on it, with the most ominous being named M Cave Hike. The reason why this video is significant is what we'll be getting into, and is directly correlated with the mysterious disappearance of Kenny Veatch. The year is 2014, and Kenny Veatch is on YouTube looking at interesting videos, similar to what you're doing right now. And Kenny happened to stumble on a video that was rather obscure. It was a video of a son of an Area 51 technician, and in this video he was talking about things that his father had told him while drunk. After watching this video, Kenny left a comment describing a very odd situation he experienced near Area 51 himself. In the comment, he mentioned that when he was hiking in the Sheep Range, which is very close to Area 51, he discovered a cave that was shaped like the letter M. As he approached this cave, the cave made his body vibrate, and the closer that he got to this cave, the more that his body began to vibrate and feel unease. He described the feeling as uncomfortable and made him feel scared, so scared in fact that he didn't approach the cave any further, and actually did the exact opposite, fleeing from the cave immediately and going directly back to his car, cutting his hike short. This comment was simply intended to share a peculiar story that happened also with Area 51, but his comment quickly gained attention. People began to reply to Kenny's comment, either questioning the authenticity behind it, sharing sympathy, or even motivating him to go and revisit this location to find the truth and dig deeper on what exactly was going on. After getting enough responses of people either telling him his story was fake or telling him that he needs to prove his claim or seek more truth by revisiting the cave, he planned a second trip. And in October of 2014, Kenny Veatch returned to the Sheep Range outside of Area 51 in an attempt to locate the M-shaped cave. This second trip was documented, and that documentation is the video titled M Cave Hike. Already, there's some interesting things about this situation. Specifically, that in this 20-minute video, Veatch reported that he saw a black Ram truck watching him from the ridgeline in the mountain range behind him this entire hike that he was having. And he was also not able to find this cave the second time around. But obviously, the mystery doesn't end here. and it's only truly beginning. After the first hike ending in fear and abandonment, and the second hike ending in failure, Kenny planned a third trip, where he publicly announced that he would be looking for the M Cave and be finding it once and for all. On November 10th, 2014, only a few weeks after the second attempt, Kenny Veach went on a third expedition looking for the M Cave. This third hike was like any other hike Kenny could have gone on. He packed a cell phone, a gun, and other supplies into his truck, and even informed his girlfriend before he left what he was up to and where he was going to be. He did not give specific details about his location, but he did tell her that he was going on a trip, he was looking for the M Cave, and he would be back at some point, which was typical behavior for Kenny. He was an experienced outdoorsman, and it wasn't uncommon for him to spend multiple days outside alone. Although when Kenny left for this third expedition looking for the M Cave, he was never seen again. After several days of not hearing anything from Kenny, his girlfriend reported him missing, and a large-scale search was underway. The search party looking for Kenny consisted of volunteers and officials from the Nevada Search and Rescue Team, and these men and women worked tirelessly day and night, searching high and low through mountains and caves of the Mojave Desert. One of the biggest challenges these search and rescue teams faced was the fact that the general location that Kenny said he was going was not an easy hike at all. It was mountainous. The landscape was dotted with old mine shafts. The area itself was isolated, and according to Kenny in old forum posts, it took roughly 10 hours of hiking to go from his car to the M Cave, meaning that this search and rescue crew had a lot of ground to cover. On top of just geographical issues, this area was also known for being dangerous. Specifically because it was so remote and so isolated, there was reports of drug activity and even bodies being dumped in the general area. Not to mention being literally beside a military base, there was also claims of reported chemical disposal in the area as well. However, even with this uphill battle that the volunteers and search and rescue team were facing, they still continued their search. And on November 22nd, 12 days after Kenny had initially left for this third trip to the M Cave, the search team found something. Near an abandoned mine shaft, one of the search and rescue members found a cell phone that was confirmed to have been owned by Kenny Veach. But unfortunately, this was the only piece of evidence that was ever found. There was no piece of clothing, no other personal items, and no clues anywhere. The only information that the phone really gave was that Kenny likely got to where he was looking to go, as this phone was in the general location that Kenny described the M Cave being in. But that's where the facts end and the speculation begins. Because after the disappearance of Kenny Veach gained attention, people began to have a plethora of theories. Likely the most possible and accepted conclusion to the story actually comes from Kenny's girlfriend herself. As years after this entire situation happened, she was informed that Kenny's story was going viral online, and she felt compelled to leave a comment on Kenny's M Cave hike video. The comment is long, and if you want to read it in its entirety, on screen is a screenshot, and I will quickly mention the main points Kenny's girlfriend Sharon makes. One of the biggest revelations that Sharon shares in this comment was that Kenny had been struggling with depression for many years. She, being his girlfriend, was obviously aware of this, and he had opened up to her, and he had made it clear to her that in the time leading up to his disappearance, it was progressively getting worse. And Kenny had even expressed his thoughts of suicide to Sharon directly. That alone is extremely upsetting, both for Kenny and for his girlfriend, who had to carry that burden with him. And if you or a loved one have experienced depression, then you know how upsetting even that part of the story is. One chilling quote Kenny mentioned to Sharon was that if he ever decided to end things, quote, "No one will ever find me." On top of sharing this quote, she also stated a very interesting fact, that Kenny had not taken his video camera for this third attempt to find the M Cave, which was odd because his second attempt was filmed, and he even hyped up his third attempt in video. So why would he not bring his camera on a trip that he publicly said he would be filming? Sharon claims that he didn't take his camera because he obviously didn't intend to record anything. On top of sharing facts, Sharon also shared a few of her own suspicions. She believes that Kenny specifically left his phone in a mine shaft to avoid being tracked. And she even states explicitly that, quote, "I believe he committed suicide. He battled depression for many years and would not take medication or see a doctor. He quit his job a little more than a year before he disappeared." Truthfully, I don't know if anybody could possibly make a stronger claim than Sharon. She was in a committed, long-term relationship with Kenny, knew the ins and outs of his personality and life, and was the last person who ever saw Kenny. However, with Kenny never being found, it's impossible to confirm these claims. And when facts aren't concrete, people are always going to make their own assumptions. Leading leading to the other two theories surrounding Kenny's disappearance. The second theory is that Kenny simply experienced an accidental death, which is possible considering the conditions that Kenny was hiking in. The Nevada desert is harsh, with extremely hot and extremely cold temperatures, and specifically in the area of the M Cave, there was a plethora of old mine shafts to potentially fall into. However, the elephant in the room obviously is the fact that Kenny was experienced in this area, and on top of being experienced in this specific area, he was also an experienced outdoorsman, making this theory a bit tough to believe, but still plausible. However, the third theory is really just a conspiracy theory, and is essentially just the belief that Kenny was getting too close to finding something out, and for that reason, Kenny was killed by the US military, specifically so he didn't discover the secret of the M Cave. It's definitely out there, but with no facts and no sign of Kenny ever being found, it's not impossible. Potentially one of the most interesting facts about this entire situation is that even though so many aspects of the story are still available online, Kenny's YouTube channel, Kenny's video about the M Cave, Kenny's girlfriend's comment on the M Cave video, the one thing that was removed from the internet was Kenny's comment on the original video that sparked this entire situation. Whether Kenny deleted it or someone else deleted it, the comment was there and somewhere along the line was removed. Nobody truly knows what happened to Kenny Veach and where he may be today, dead or alive. It's Saturday, October the 21st, 1978. Relatively new pilot Frederick Valentich was embarking on a short training flight in a Cessna 128L light aircraft. The flight itself wasn't extremely long, only 232 kilometers or 125 nautical miles. And this flight was connecting Melbourne, Australia to King Island following the Bass Strait. At this point, Frederick had 150 total flight hours and even held a Class 4 instrument rating, which authorized him to fly at night with the restriction of only being able to fly at night in visible meteorological conditions, essentially meaning clear enough skies to be able to see the ground, terrain, and other aircraft. Frederick had also applied twice to enlist in the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected each time due to inadequate educational qualifications. Although as determined as Frederick was to become a pilot, his grades weren't necessarily reflecting his passion. On top of actively taking training flights and also being in the Air Training Corps for the Australian Air Force, Frederick was also studying to become a commercial pilot as well. Although, even with all of his training, he failed all 5 of his commercial license exams twice. Even with failed exams and rejected applications, Frederick was motivated to fly, and this brings us back to October 21st, 1978. Frederick's takeoff was normal, and the beginning of his flight appeared to be relatively calm and uneventful, although things began to get peculiar when he radioed to the Melbourne flight service at 7:06 p.m. It was in this radio message that he reported an unidentified aircraft that was following him at 4,500 feet. Air traffic control confirmed that there was no traffic at that level, although Frederick was certain that he was seeing something. Frederick replied stating that he could see a large unknown aircraft, which appeared to be illuminated but couldn't confirm the exact type of plane he was looking at. And then quickly after confirmed that this plane had passed over him, roughly 1,000 feet above him, moving at a very fast speed. Once again, air traffic control had no answers. Almost immediately after, Frederick radioed in again, saying that this aircraft was orbiting above him and that it had a shiny metal surface with a green light on it. And then also stated that this other pilot might be purposely toying with him in his aircraft. And it was with his next radio message that Frederick revealed something concerning. He was experiencing engine problems. But before Frederick could even finish his sentence, air traffic control was asking him, what kind of plane is this? To which Frederick could only say, it's not an aircraft. And it was right after he said these words. His transmissions were interrupted by the sounds of metallic scraping, all contact was lost, and Frederick was never heard from again. It wasn't long after the connection was cut that a search and rescue mission was underway, and a sea and air search took place to find him as soon as possible. The search went on for 4 days, and was concluded on October 25th, 1978 with no results. No sign of Frederick, no signs of his plane. The investigation was simply presumed fatal. The story is obviously upsetting and doesn't end there, and I didn't even mention this earlier, but when this all took place, Frederick was only 20 years old. He was a young, semi-experienced, and also struggling pilot. Frederick also had gotten into legal trouble from some of his flights, specifically for accidentally flying into controlled air zones in Sydney, and even intentionally flying into clouds, which was prohibited for his classifications. Both of these are odd, because if you are dedicating your life to a career in aviation, why would you intentionally fly into clouds on multiple occasions if you knew it could lead to prosecution, which in his case, it almost did. Those facts are interesting, but what's also interesting is a quote from Frederick's father, who stated that Frederick was not only a large believer in UFOs, UFOs, but was also seriously worried about being attacked by them on his flights. It's even stated that 6 days before his disappearance, Frederick talked to his girlfriend specifically about the possibility that a UFO could take him away. And potentially what's most odd about this entire flight that Frederick took was the fact that he never told anybody the truth of why he was taking this flight. Sure, it was a relatively standard training flight, but why on a Saturday evening? His flight took off at 6 p.m. and it was a multi-hour flight. It's reported that Frederick told flight officials that he was just going to King Island to pick up some friends and fly them back. But it's also reported that he told other officials that he was going to pick up crayfish. And after the disappearance happened, investigations confirmed that both of these stated reasons were untrue. But that's where the facts end. And once again, where the speculation begins to run wild. All we know is that we have a 20-year-old struggling pilot in training who has an interesting obsession and fear of UFOs, who took a mysterious flight from Melbourne to King Island, and during this flight claimed to have seen a UFO and was never seen again. But it's curious to think of what could have possibly happened. And obviously, since 46 years have passed since this entire situation happened, some theories have popped up. One of the official suspicions comes from the Western Australia Department of Transportation, who stated that Frederick became disoriented, saw his own lights reflected in the water, or saw a nearby island while flying upside down, which is potentially plausible, but there was no communication indicating that Frederick was in such a situation that would have left him upside down. Some people believe that Frederick actually staged his own disappearance, and instead of going to King Island, was actually going to Cape Otway, which was possible to fly to with the plane that Frederick was in and with the amount of fuel that he had. And although there's no radar to confirm this activity in the Cape Otway area, Melbourne police did receive reports of a mysterious landing that took place by a light aircraft at the same time that Frederick disappeared. A third and potentially most disheartening theory is that Frederick did this intentionally. Although interviews with doctors and personal friends of Frederick all stated that this was likely impossible, which, I mean, nothing's impossible, but if nobody thinks that this is the case, I think there's validity that this might not be the answer. And one of the last major groups of belief involves aliens. Basically, UFOologists claim that UFOs either destroyed Frederick's ship with Frederick inside or abducted him and then destroyed his ship. And you could potentially put some validity on these claims due to what Frederick was actually saying in his radio comms. Those are kind of three of the initial theories, but there are actually more modern theories that are definitely worth mentioning. The first comes from Brian Dunning, who made the observation that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out a few years before this entire situation, and the things that Frederick was saying on the radio kind of sounded similar from some of the dialogue from the movie, not to mention the fact that this movie was also popular with pilots. So with that information, Dunning ultimately speculated that Frederick likely was trying to reenact the scene in real life for his own, personal enjoyment. He was deliberately flying his aircraft in a sporadic manner to kind of put on a show for air traffic controllers, but within him having this fun and saying these lies and flying in an unsafe way, he essentially became disoriented and crashed unintentionally. I'm not sure how valid it is, but I think it's interesting to consider, specifically knowing that he did intentionally fly into clouds when he wasn't supposed to, so it's not like he wasn't against breaking the rules. So if you really loved this movie and really loved aliens, maybe he thought it'd be cool to take a little flight, tell the story on the way, and then once he came back, he'd be like, wow, that was crazy, I had a UFO encounter, and just basically allow that legend to live on as part of his personal lore. But like I mentioned, these are all speculations, and the mystery of the missing pilot, Frederick Valentich, remains to this day unsolved, 46 years and 6 months later. Unfortunately, there is a lot more unsolved missing persons cases. And if you guys truly enjoyed this video and would like me to create a series out of it, just leave a comment below or leave a like. Your support never goes unnoticed and is always appreciated. But with that being said, let's continue to the final story. The year is 1993, and we are days away from the much anticipated Super Bowl weekend. David Glenn Lewis, like almost any man at the time, was excited about Super Bowl weekend. And coincidentally, David was about to have Super Bowl weekend all to himself. David was a lawyer and a family man, and he lived with his wife and daughter in Amarillo, Texas. David's wife and daughter were actually going to Houston for the weekend to have a bit of a getaway, and specifically do some shopping. Now, this is a trip that David would typically be a part of, but because this was Super Bowl weekend, he decided that he'd stay back because he didn't want to miss the big game, and likely just wanted some alone time as well. On Friday, January 29th, 1993, David's wife and daughter left for their planned shopping trip in Dallas. But on January 31st, after what I can only imagine to be a fun shopping trip, David's wife and daughter returned home slightly later in the evening, basically right after after the Super Bowl ended. But what they came home to was a bit peculiar. The TV was on, the VCR was actually still recording the game, there was 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the fridge, there was laundry in the laundry machine, David's wedding ring and watch were on the kitchen counter, but David was nowhere to be seen. David's wife, Karen, obviously assumed David was somewhere nearby, potentially watching the game at a friend's house, although when they didn't find him at all that night, they began to get concerned. The following morning, on February 1st, David's wife, Karen, called the police and reported him missing. But like every other story in this video, this isn't where the story ends. It's where the story begins. And in this story specifically, the twist at the end of it is potentially the most mind-boggling in this entire video. Back to February 1st. What happened? Karen was convinced that her husband wasn't just at a friend's house for the night watching the game, and although she may have been slightly irritated or concerned the night before, this morning she was only concerned, and that concern was growing. Once police were involved, it wasn't long before information began rolling in. Although with all of the information coming to light about the situation, there was only more questions being uncovered and almost no answers. The first pieces of information that became available came from the police. The same day that the report was made, police actually found Lewis's car parked downtown by a courthouse. When the police searched his car, they found all of his keys under the floor mat. Also hidden within the car were David's checkbook, driver's license, and 2 of his credit cards. After police found David's vehicle, they checked his bank activity, and it was at that point when the plot only grew thicker, because his bank activity was strange to say the least. On January 30th, the day after his wife and daughter left town, $5,000 was deposited into his account, but it's unknown who did this and why they did this. And then the next day, the 31st, the day of the Super Bowl, either David or someone using David's card purchased a plane ticket from Amarillo to Dallas, and then another plane ticket was purchased from Los Angeles to Dallas. Both of these plane tickets were in David's name, but it's unconfirmed if either of these plane tickets were used. When the police first brought all of these discoveries to Karen, she was obviously concerned, but little did the police know that Karen had her own bombshell for the police. Karen mentioned to the police that David specifically expressed to Karen that he felt like his life was in danger. Lewis had specifically been a defendant in a lawsuit brought against him and several other lawyers, although after several months of this lawsuit going on, David was the only defendant who has not yet disposed the case. Some people believe that the law firm that David worked for that was being sued by a previous client were pressuring David into giving a disposition that wasn't fully accurate, trying to make him lie about some of the wrongdoings of the law firm that he worked for the benefit of the law firm. Because all of the other lawyers at this law firm had given a disposition and David hadn't, it definitely could have put a target on his back if he was not willing to comply with their less than integral requests of him. For 11 months following the disappearance, even with all of the weird information that they found initially and continued to find, there was absolutely no sign of David anywhere. Not a motive, not a body, not evidence, nothing, literally nothing. And after those 11 months, the official conclusion that the authorities came to on this case was that David must have just left on his own accord and decided to start a new life somewhere else without telling anybody. And undoubtedly, that was a hard pill to swallow for the family. But unfortunately, that was the reality they had to accept. And that alone is crazy and peculiar. If the story ended right there, this would definitely be a story worthy of this video. Somebody disappearing without a trace who seemed to have been home hours ago is just mind-boggling. But the story doesn't end here at all, because 10 years after the case was closed, a bombshell was dropped on the entire situation. In 2004, just over 10 years after David initially went missing, a bored police officer in Washington state was researching cold cases while on duty. Something this police officer likely did often. And on this specific day, this police officer had stumbled on the case of David Glenn Lewis. At first, the story was like many others that he read, but what caught his attention was the photo associated with this missing person. This police officer took one look at David and realized that this was somebody that he had not only seen before, but this was a man that he had found dead 10 years ago. This person that he had found dead in 1993 was actually a hit-and-run case. And because he was so sure that he had seen this man before, he did a bit more digging and tried to line up the dates. And he was able to confirm that the man that he had found dead, he had found only a day after David Lewis was reported missing, meaning that the timelines added up and he had some further digging to do. This is where things get even more strange, because the person this police officer found in Washington state in this hit and run case, although he looked like David Lewis, he didn't have any identification of being David Lewis. He was an unknown person wearing military fatigues walking down the side of the highway with no ID and no personal belongings at all. And unfortunately, he was struck by a vehicle and left for dead, which is where the police officer eventually found him. But even though this police officer was certain that these people looked the exact same, and the dates kind of lined up. How could he be sure that these two people were the same person? After all, this hit and run case took place 1,600 miles from where David Lewis supposedly disappeared from. And although there was plane tickets on David Lewis's credit cards, none of them involved Washington State. So the only way this police officer could know for certain was by getting a DNA test done, which after some time and some convincing, he was able to have the DNA test performed. And the results from that test confirmed that this unnamed man that was found dead on the side of the road on February 1st, 1993 in Washington State was indeed David Glenn Lewis, who was only a night earlier watching the Super Bowl in the comfort of his own home. Nobody knows why David was in Washington State, a place where he had no friends, no family, no connections. Nobody even knows how he got to Washington State. His own personal vehicle was at the courthouse. He was wearing military fatigues that weren't his. And nobody even knows why he even left his couch, let alone the state. So like I mentioned, even though a decade after this disappearance happened, his body was found and confirmed, nothing about this mystery is solved whatsoever, and no substantial evidence up until today has been discovered. Even with this discovery, even though David specifically claimed that he believed his life was in danger, it is officially believed that David simply got up and decided to leave on his own accord, and there was no foul play whatsoever. And for the families, I truly feel for them, because I can't imagine how disheartening it is to have that official conclusion be the case when obviously something was going on here. But unfortunately, this story and the other two we spoke about all have the same ending. No truth is officially known. The causes, the motivations, the truth about what actually happened is still a mystery, and might remain a mystery forever. The craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons. Primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was two options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number one, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. When it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although the scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's Age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Ea Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Ea Nasser from Nani, which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Ea Nasser, and I'll let you decide whether or not Ea Nasser was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani is being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Ea Nasser, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, and not only is he selling a low quality product, but he's promising a high quality product, and when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions, and not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after his complaint, and Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Ea Nasser do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to Ea Nasser's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with Ea Nasser anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from Ea Nasser, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Ea Nasser as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers. Iron Age. The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free away from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC, and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam, it's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age, and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively, and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted, and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper, while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually 5. And the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's gonna create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make this section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age. Coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody. The Classical Era. Although we are now in the classical era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the classical era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the classical era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt. And he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight. And he really was out nothing. And he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the classical era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the classical era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period, the medieval era. I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, Saint John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either Saint John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it. The Renaissance era. If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. The sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo, and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art. The early modern era. We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals. King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant-class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you. Because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again, but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current king of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing. And this siege failed, and once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government, because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial 2 lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long-lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is.